How y'all doing? For this review, I'm going to cover two books, both anthologies done by the same author, Ashton Smith. They are Zothique, The Final Cycle, and the Averoigne Chronicles. Now, I always wanted to get collections of these two, and these are relatively new, about a year. These were published a year or two ago by Hippocampus Press. I'll talk to you about them in a minute. And what they are is just a collection of similar themed stories. Zothique is an anthology that takes place in the far distant future where Earth is, all the continents are merged down to one. Our society and our technology is not even a memory. Everyone's down to a sword and sandals type of society, necromancing everywhere. The old gods are returned under different names, and these are the stories that involve in that. The sun is not as bright as what it used to. It's kind of dimmed to a dark red, and these are just various stories and anecdotes about that. Averoigne is a series of short stories that takes place in a fictionalized area in France, where in this area all sorts of supernatural stuff happens. Gargoyles, demons, necromancing, what have you. So, let's explore some of the stories here, and I'll talk a little bit more at the end about some of my thoughts on Ashton Smith. So, in this book, there are 21 short stories and poems. They almost alternate short story, poem, what have you. But I'm going to go through several short stories involved on this. So let's start with my list here. Empire of the Necromancers. That is a story of two necromancers who are on their travels from their original Isle of Knot. They find this necropolis where they decide, hey, let's rule here. Let's raise the dead and be kings here. And they do. And while they live their debauched lifestyle with their raised servants, two of the raised dead gain some consciousness and find their way to get back at these necromancers. The next story is more closer to the sword and sorcery vein. We're familiar with the pulps of the time, particularly the Weird Tales, where many of these were published. Necromancy in Knot, where a man tries to save the woman he loves who has been kidnapped from slavers. And in the middle of the chase from these slavers, him and the slavers were now got caught into a bad, I think it was a bad current that drove him to this isle of famous for its necromancers, Knot, N-A-A-T. And unfortunately, the necromancers have got her under their control, and the main protagonist is trying to find his way to try to get her, to work with these three, and try and get her love back. So it has a little bit of a twist ending from a normal sword and sorcery story. The next story is Zithra. It's a story about a goat herder while tending his flock finds a cave. He goes into this cave, and he finds himself in another land with its own light, and these trees with fruit on it are guarded by these giants. Well, he sneaks a fruit and takes it, and his mind is now taken over with the memories of someone else. He starts to believe himself as this new person. He doesn't have memories. At first it was a struggle, but now he believes he is this other person who's a ruler of a far distant land. So he travels to it and finds out that the place he once ruled is no longer exist. I won't go too much into that. Let's move on. Master of the Crabs. This involves a necromancer as apprentice on a race to go to this one isle called the Isle of Crabs. Obviously what it has in there. He's trying to find a treasure that he found out it was there. A very special treasure for himself, but he's got competition with another sorcerer of his kind. There's a lot of necromancers in these stories, and that's a very appeal about them. Weaver in the Vault. And now this one's a story about three henchmen who are to deliver a king's remains to a vault outside of their city. But as they go there, an earthquake kind of kills two of them and wounds the third and blocks out their exit. So the third one, now surviving, is seeing something that's in the vault interacting with the dead here. I don't want to give too much away here, but let's move on. Now here's one that's actually a play. This will be interesting to see play out. It was just right production, but it also kind of leaves, when I finish reading it the first time, kind of feels like it stops on a cliffhanger. It doesn't feel truly complete. But he stopped it there. He says, Clark says it was complete. So, this play is The Dead Will Cuckold You. This is a story about a necromancer getting after a king who outlawed his, he doesn't want necromancers in his city. So before the necromancer leaves, he does his little revenge on this ruler by raising the dead of a bard who the ruler killed out of a little game of jealousy, from of his wife. I may not be summarizing that purely, but it is what it is. Again, these are short stories. I try not to give too much away. Just try to give you the premise. So again, this is about a bard that was killed by a jealous ruler because he played for his wife alone, and that's just a little game he plays and all that. But the necromancer gets his revenge on him. So hopefully that's a better on that. The Dark Eidolon. Now this one, if I have to recommend any of the stories first to read in Zothique, this is not the first in the volume, but it's further down. But it's probably the first one I want to read because it does give the perfect introduction. Let me see if I can find it. The first paragraph describes the world of Zothique entirely. We'll read for it. On Zothique, the last continent on Earth, the sun no longer shone with the whiteness of its prime, but was dim and tarnished as if with a vapor of blood. New stars without number have declared themselves in the heavens, and the shadows of the infinite have fallen closer. And out of shadows the older gods have returned to man. The gods forgotten since Hyperborea, since Mu and Poseidonus, bearing other names, but the same attributes. And the elder gods have also returned, battering mightily in the fumes of evil sacrifice and fostering again the primordial sorcery. I may have should have read that part first before I got into this, but the story is about a man who was a beggar in a city, who everyone ignored, including the ruler, who ran him over with his horse, leaving him forever crippled. Well, the beggar eventually, got out of the city and learned necromancy, and he comes back to gain revenge on the ruler, who doesn't even know he exists. So it's a revenge story, and how he carries out his revenge. Does he go too far? Well, I don't want to give too much away again. Let's move on. Morthyla. Now, this is an interesting anecdote. It's kind of it has a twist and pretty sad, but it runs to the theme of the stories here. This is about a poet who, through his boredom, the decadence of the city he was living with, was suggested by a ruler he was on, a ruler of the palace he was living into. If you're bored and all that, and seeking for something more meaningful, you might find it in this necropolis, which is rumored to have a lamia, which is sort of a female vampire. Again, common thing that shows up in Clark Ashton Smith's works. So does lamia exist in the city? Perhaps you can find something interesting there. He goes to the city, and he does find a woman who claims himself to be a lamia. So they start resist temptation for a little bit till a time, and I don't want to give away the twist, bit of a twist ending here, but it's kind of sad. As I say, it's more of an antidote of the story you might find in this world. All right, going on here. The Garden of Adompha. This is the most morbid, grotesque of all the stories that I've read of all this, and it involves imagine a city with a massive building on it that's completely closed off. There are no windows. There's only one doorway in, which the ruler has access to. What's in this massive building that no one can see in and out, that not even the sun can peek through? Well, it's a garden with its own internal light source. But the plants are not your conventional things you find in a garden. As I say, it's grotesque, and in fact, that growing on these plants are body parts. Feet, hands, breast of a woman, that sort of thing, integrated into the plants. How did they get here? Well, a necromancer helps make these plants by combining, by taking the people that the ruler of the city does not like anymore and puts them into his garden through this manner. I think we're introduced to one woman who, after she was before she was transferred by necromancers, anything to preserve her hands. She had a wonderful use for her hands. And eventually he takes out the necromancer, but the necromancer gets his revenge. Next story here is the Isle of the Torturers. There's a story about a man who, escaping the city from the plague, which he has on him, but is kept in check by a special ring that was given to him. As long as he keeps the ring on, the plague will not affect him or anyone else that comes near him. Well, on his journey out of the city to try and do something about it, he gets swept from a ship into another isle that's called the Isle of the Torturers. I know, we're not, doesn't seem too creative by the ideas. Isle of the Crabs, Isle of the Torturers, things like that. But again, you look past that. And of course, the people in this city take him in, and of course they torture him and the crew that remains. They imprison him in a cell with a glass-like barrier where he can see into the ocean. They do all sorts of horrific things, and he it may be obvious based on my description on how he gets out of that, but I'll leave details when you eventually read it. The other one is the Voyage of King Averoigne. Now, this is a story that, according to the editor of this, Ronald S. Hilger, who did this, and he also did the editor for the Chronicles of Averoigne. Now, this was a story that was originally for Clark Ashton Smith's other stories for Poseidonus. So it's not as dark and dreary relative to the other stories. But because he didn't sell it in Poseidonus before, he cannibalized it into his Zothique story. Still a good story, and it's about a king through he was a king who doing his job, and in the middle of torturing people, which he enjoys, he is kind of cursed by a necromancer which had I think if I recall, there was a crown, a feather from his hat from a rare bird, and he makes it to where it makes it where he's missing and flown out to another land. I won't give details about that. I'm not making it sound as weird as it is, but it might have been a while since I read this, but I digress. So now the king's on a quest to try and find this special part of the crown that symbolizes that, in his journey to try and get it. But of course, that was Zothique. Now we go into the Averoigne Chronicles. So again, these are stories that take place in a fictionalized area of France, mostly medieval France. So, but Zothique is very dark and dreary compared to this. This one, while they still have some relatively horror stories and stuff of that, and plenty, it's more of an enchanting feel compared to Zothique. So let's go over a few of the stories. There's about 20 some odd. There's 20 stories and poems to go with this, and I'll go over a few of them. A night in, sorry if I get those French names wrong. A night in Malniant, or maybe Malnion, but I'm digressing. It said this is a story about a man who, running away from the death of somebody he knows, comes to a city, and while trying to seek rest there, the people are very scarce, and whoever he finds says, "No, we cannot help you. We're preparing for a funeral." So that is an interesting, dark little anecdote about that. And so, again, moving on. The maker of gargoyles. A stonemason creates these two gargoyles for a cathedral, but then later we start hearing how people are killed and molested, and apparently the gargoyles are connected to this. All right, the holiness of Azendarach. All right, so here we have a bishop, a very corrupt bishop, with some very damning things, things he's not supposed to get into as a priest. But somebody has found out about it and is inadvertently taken this information to someone who, when they look upon this piece of evidence, the bishop is going to be going to lose it all here. So what does he do? Well, he sends somebody to put a spell on him that will take him into the distant past. And they succeeded. He goes to the tavern. Some guy talks to this individual, and then he has him take a drink, and now he's in the past and everything. Well, at first, not knowing what's happening, he almost gets to be sacrificed by the people of that time. And a woman comes up who is an enchantress who wants to help him out. So she says, "Okay, I know this guy. This guy who sent you back here. I know of him. He came back before, and I'll help you try and get your revenge on him, but stay a while." So, will he stay? Will he go back to get his revenge? Will he go back? Again, I'll leave that to you as the readers. Now, the next one, the Colossus of Elorn, if I'm pronouncing that right. This one is a bit more of the more sword and sorcery base, where we have this wizard, a decrepit wizard, who everyone mistreated. Again, this is similar to the Zothique story of the Dark Eidolon. So he wants to get his revenge. Him and his apprentices start raising up the dead, and uses his dead as a means to create something that will finally get revenge to the people of Averoigne. But who's going to stop him? Well, a former apprentice who walked out on him is knowing about this, knows who it is, and is trying to find ways to stop him. Now this one, the next one is Enchantress of Selaire. Now here we have a hermit, right? He's a hermit because he's been heartbroken by a woman he fell in love to who rejected him. So he becomes a hermit. But one day, as he walks out, he comes across a pool and there's this beautiful woman bathing in it who notices him, and she allows him to follow him into her enchanted world there. And she reveals herself that she's an enchantress, and that she, and eventually starts building a relationship with her. In the meanwhile, there's this wolf that, while giving him dark looks, is kind of kept at bay at her. Finds out that he later finds out when he was alone that this wolf is actually a werewolf, but a man was able to change back at a certain time to warn him that this woman is not who she appears, and I have a means to help you out. Who's right? Is the wolf trying to trick him? Is the woman trying to trick him? What decision to make? I like the twist ending on this. I find it very lighthearted and everything, but not to give too much away. But moving on, the Beasts of Averoigne. This is more straightforward stories. Again, most of these were done in Weird Tales magazine, so you may find them formulaic, but I do like their overall theme about this. And this one's The Beast of Averoigne is pretty straightforward in its title. A comet passes over Averoigne, and all of a sudden people are dying by this mysterious monster that can drink their fluids and just vanishes in thin air. So now they're trying to find out what's the nature of this beast, where did it come from, how will they stop it. Again, pretty straightforward. But, now this one, another grotesque story, The Mother of Toads, where the story of the Garden of Dodonphus is probably the most grotesque one in Zothique. This one I find the most grotesque one in the Averoigne. This is simply a story of a man who has fallen victim to a witch's enchantment, and does very grotesque things with him and where he cannot escape. This has actually been adapted by Dark Horse Comics in one of their ghost story books. Not necessarily it's not real. Some of it has featuring I think it was ghosts, witches, and stuff like that. So I think this is their witches book. I don't know the exact name of it, but some of you may know what I'm talking about. Dark Horse Comics makes it. And it was illustrated by Gary Gianni, who actually illustrated some of the Conan ones that Del Rey Books published. But I digress again. And then we have the Disinterment of Venus. This one I've read before in another anthology, where we have monks in a monastery. While digging up the rocks out of a potential garden that they're going to make, find a statue. Statue of Venus back in Rome. But this one is causing some interesting things that happen to monks who gaze upon it. Very uncelibate things. So, is it a statue? Is it just them? Or how will they stop it? I'll leave it at that. So, with Clark Ashton Smith, he's one of the top 3 writers of the pulps in the Weird Tales magazine outlet. So you're already probably familiar with the other 2. Robert E. Howard, who's famous for Conan and other adventure stories of that ilk, like Solomon Kane, Brad McMorran, and all that. But Conan is his most famous, so we all know about that. The other was H.P. Lovecraft. I know a lot of you know about what he is because he's everywhere. He's still in fiction. You still find books in countless games, both role playing and board games, what have you. But Clark Ashton Smith is the 3rd one. It's interesting. Many of you may not even know about him, may have heard of him, but why is he not as huge? Well, they didn't adapt much of his stuff outside of his original writings. There's only like a couple of film adaptations. One was a Night Gallery episode from years ago, I think Return to Sorcerer, and I don't think it was a very good adaptation, if I recall. And there was Mother of Toads, which was adapted for an anthology of horror stories. I think you could find it here on Tubi for free at the time of filming this. You can put down Mother of Toads at IMDb and then find out where it's at and find it from there. However, there are some things that he has influenced many people, particularly in the gaming world. Mr. Welch, I found out, he tells about Mystara, and one of the things about the old Mystara modules, which they have adapted to 5th edition, you might find a big orange book for the people who make Dungeon Crawl classics of Castle Amber. That book is a series of adventures that is directly taken from his Averoigne stories. So, you get that. If you read this and get Castle Amber, they take things directly from it and keep the themes to the new stuff they have about. So, mostly it's readers that kept him going in perpetuity. For the interesting thing about Clark Ashton Smith, there's a documentary by Hippocampus Press, the same guys who produced these 2 books. So they made a documentary about Clark Ashton Smith. It is called Clark Ashton Smith, the Emperor of Dreams. It talks about him, his early life, how his education was, how he became pen pals with of H.P. Lovecraft, and how that influenced his writing. He's mostly a poet. And before he did the weird fiction that we know of now, he did poetry before. And then when he was collaborating with H.P. Lovecraft, that's when he started doing a lot of short stories for the pulps. That's where we have Zothique and the Averoigne stories and many other stories about that. He's even done science fiction stories, Mars and stuff and all that. But always this wonderful weird thing. They're not all horror stories. They're not all sword and sorcery. They're all a combination of different types of stories. But he is very good at supernatural weirdness. I think Mr. Welch said it best. And his writing style has a nice eloquence about it. What he brings into poetry, he brings into stories to bring an atmosphere. Some people think it's too much. I think it's a wonderful thing. It keeps imagery that he makes of the necromancers that he writes in his stories, make it to where they don't feel like bad 1970s van art, if you understand what I mean. So, watch that documentary, because I had one YouTuber who I'm subscribed to and subscribed to me. I mentioned him in the chat about I was reading Clark Ashton Smith. We didn't get too far into this. He says he only read one book and only 2 stories that he liked about it. He didn't care much for Clark Ashton Smith. No, that's fair. Okay. Yeah, I didn't discuss further than that because I don't know which stories he's read, which book he has. He might bring it up on his channel, All Fiction is Fiction, for those who are interested. But I think that what I like about Clark Ashton Smith, not only is his dark stories, he goes the opposite of people like Howard, where Robert E. Howard usually has the wizard as the antagonist to the barbaric hero, or to the hard physical adventurer. He takes it, he flips it around and says, now we get to see from the necromancer's point of view. Mostly are, necromancers or other sorcerers. Not all are evil, but you get to see, it's good to see a story from that other end and what brings the dark and weirdness about this. I think Clark Ashton Smith is something you probably want into your library. Because the way he describes scenes, or what he describes, is probably good for people who are gamers, particularly dungeon masters, in describing their worlds. He has a way of doing it that people should not neglect about this. Now, if you're interested in other ones, I have this one book. It's out of print. I got it from I think it looks like Prime published it. Return of the Sorcerer, the best of Clark Ashton Smith. This has some of the Averoigne stories in Zothique, and that's how I knew about those worlds enough to make me want to eventually find books. But the paperback books they made from the a while back usually were pretty pricey on eBay, but these ones are new. You can get a regular price at Amazon, so there's that. But if you can't find that one, I think that one's out of print. Penguin Classics has produced another anthology. Again, it's not all the same stories. When it comes to anthologies, you'll find overlapping stories go back and forth. So you'll find the Dark Alien, you'll find Zethro, you'll find some of the Averoigne stories, but also his poetry, so you get a sample of that. Going back to the documentary, if you're the type of person that reads the stories and don't like what he presents, maybe it's not done well enough for you, you could probably look past that and see the ideas behind it and be inspired into this. In addition to that, he's not only done just the short stories and poems, he's also done paintings. He makes carved little statues. And I think when you watch this documentary and when they show you all of what he's done, if you are the type of person that looks at this and doesn't feel like he's presented it well enough to you, you could look past that and say, I see where you're going with that, and let that inspire you to how to create a wonderful mood and atmosphere, instead of just plain written like this. But for those of you who don't want to necessarily purchase these ones and be left disappointed, and you want to get a taste of it, YouTube has plenty of people who has taken these stories I have mentioned and then some, and they have already did their own audio books that you can find all right here. You can find the Dark Eidolon, you can find Zethro, you can find the Gardens of Adonphis. There are people who do audio just for YouTube of that. So you could give yourself a test on that, and you could get an idea of why I enjoy these stories and why others have enjoyed about these stories. So, going back to the documentary, this is wonderful part, because Harlan Ellison was interviewed for this documentary, and it's his last movie that he did before he died. This documentary was done by 2018, that was the year he died. He brings out a point at the end of this that struck me and is a good point. He talks about how people would say, well, how come Clark Ashton Smith is not as big? He kind of leaves it incomplete. And he says, this is the wrong question. You know, I think it's a generalized question. Is well, if he's that important, is that great? How come he's not so big? It's not the fact that it's big in order to make it important. It's the fact that people are still reading it. The Clark Ashton Smith circle, so to speak. It's mostly done by readers, and as long as there are still people reading it and enjoying it, and still passing it on to the next generation, that's Clark Ashton Smith's posterity. Is that he's not forgotten. And hopefully through a video like mine and you exploring down the rabbit hole, you can experience Clark Ashton Smith through Averoigne, through Zothique. Maybe find his posts down in his stories. Find his Penguin Classics, which, just to let you know, at this point of filming, I did not read yet, but it's on my to-read list. You know, find this in the used bookstore if you can. His stuff is free online. You go to Clark Ashton Smith Stories, and there's a website where all of his stuff is now just free for you to read. YouTube has plenty of audio adaptations of that. So he's not out of your hands if you're restricted by money. But I think if you're looking at the classics and pulps, particularly in the weird tales, and all you got is Howard and all the people that derive and derivatives and stuff like that, and Robert Howard, I think there's a facet of this that you really need to complete, and by getting Clark Ashton Smith, you know, Zothique, Averoigne stories, and his other stories, you know, that he did. And you can see the way he writes these scenes and the tone and atmosphere he brings about this. And hopefully I'll read some of his poems here in a little bit. The Hashish Eater seems to be highly recommended. But it's kind of something that is like a certain spice. You may not realize, you could probably do without it, but you'd be surprised how wonderful it is by adding it to it, even when we don't realize it. Well, with that said, that's my reviews on these two. I'm glad I picked these up. These are fairly recently new by Hippocampus Press, who did the documentary of Clark Ashton Smith, The Emperor of Dreams. Check all that out. Thank you all for watching. You have a nice day.